Good morning, good afternoon. Welcome everyone to today's webinar, Decent Work in the Labor Crunch, Attracting and Retaining Great Employees. My name is Derek Cook. I'm the director of the Canadian Poverty Institute, and I'm very pleased to welcome you, and I'm so glad you're able to join us today. This seminar is being hosted by the Canadian Poverty Institute in collaboration with the Tamarack Institute as part of our New Economy Roundtable. The New Economy Roundtable is a network of business and non-governmental organizations working together to increase decent work and create a more inclusive economy. Very glad that you're able to join us today. So we begin our workshop today by acknowledging that we are meeting on Indigenous land. As settlers, we are grateful for the opportunity to meet, and we thank all the generations of Indigenous peoples who have been taking care of this land before us. As settlers, this recognition of the contributions and historic importance of Indigenous peoples must be clearly and overtly connected to our collective commitment to make the promise and the challenge of truth and reconciliation real in our communities. Now, I'd like to introduce you to today's moderator, Ken Tigolar, who will be guiding us through the webinar. Ken Tigolar has been an active member of the New Economy Roundtable for the last 2 years. He spent 36 years working in operations management with a multinational oil company, and he now spends his time in retirement exploring how the capitalist model can evolve into a model that more justly benefits all of society. Ken has advocated for affordable housing in Canada and better living options for seniors, including through a leadership role with a group planning the first co-housing project in the Hamilton area. Welcome, Ken.
Thanks, Derek. So a short introduction to why we're here. The working poor make up the single largest group of people living in Canada, more than 1 million people. We know that working poverty is on the rise in part due to the evolving nature of work, including a growing precarious labor market, increasing contract labor, and decreasing job tenure. We recognize that this trajectory is not a healthy one, and we are exploring ways to address this issue. Today's webinar is part of that important, ongoing conversation necessary to ending working poverty. Our intent today is to hear the lived experience of an employer who has recognized that he has an important contribution to make, providing leadership in this space. We will also hear from a researcher who is interested in issues around work, including questions of youth underemployment in lower income countries, how to build decent work into new circular economy business models, and how to improve the quality of work with living wages as a starting point. She is one of the authors of the Business Case for Living Wages report, which is one of the resources available for this webinar. I encourage you to read it. One of the questions I think we need to ask ourselves is, what would it look like to treat the resolution of social challenges as a business opportunity? To kick off today's discussion, I'm happy to introduce our keynote speaker, Devinder Chaudhary. In 2020, Davinder established Anna Restaurant Collective, a fine dining establishment in Ottawa. Canada's top 100 restaurants list recognized Anna as one of the best new restaurants in Canada. Anna met the stringent requirements of the Ontario Living Wage Network and was certified as a living wage employer. Restaurant workforce. During the occupation of streets in February, Davinder co-organized a fundraising campaign, raised over $100,000, and distributed funds to 43 restaurants. Welcome, Davinder.
Thanks a lot, Ken. Thank you so much.
You have said that a living wage was a foundational part of your business plan for this venture.
Yes, absolutely, Ken. That's so true. Good morning, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank New Economy Roundtable, Canadian Poverty Institute, and Tamarack Institute for inviting me to share my experience as a living wage employer. So in 2019, I decided to open a fine dining restaurant in Ottawa. This was my maiden venture in restaurant industry. Previously, I had co-founded a financial consulting firm with operations in North America. So over the first 11 months of our planning, while we were designing and construction was underway, I got an opportunity to learn about this industry, which was quite different from that of accounting world. In fact, drastically different. Everyone associated with the project was very enthusiastic and passionate about their roles. So as expected, the job of financial projections fell in my lap, being an accountant. So little did I know that this, what I thought was going to be a 2-day project, would extend into a couple of weeks. And the reason for this protracted exercise was determination of our salary structure. Not being from restaurant industry and coming in with a new outlook, it was very interesting to see how the entire, the salary structure in restaurant industry was put in place. So as you know, so there's front end house and back of house. Front end house, our service staff, they typically work 5 to 6 hours. They get generous tips. They're cash rich at the end of the day. Next 11 a.m. next day is another story. And then there's back of house, where the line cooks and the dishwashers, the chefs, they work a good 10 to 12 hour shift, and they get paid very close to the minimum wage. And all this sounded a bit unfair. We were trying to establish, offer a Canadian cuisine to our guests, and we wanted to showcase our Canadian heritage. And fairness and reasonable compensation, I think, were very important for us from day one. So I researched into what would be a reasonable salary, because, as I said, I'd never worked or had any experience in restaurant industry, and I was kind of shocked to realize that most of the staff working, be it line cooks or dishwashers or chefs, they were content with making salary very close to minimum wage. Their expectations were numbed down to the extent that they were put in a place that they just accepted whatever came their way, which I thought was not quite reasonable. So as I researched into reasonable, or a quote unquote reasonable salary for a staff, I came across a treasure of information in Ontario Living Wage Network's website. So OLWN, which is Ontario Living Wage Network, they calculate living wage, which reflects what people need to earn to cover actual costs of cost of living in their community. So living wage draws on community-specific data to determine the expenses for a family of 2 working adults and 2 children. A living wage, as you all might know, is different from minimum wage. So minimum wage is legislated, a minimum which Ontario right now is $15, whereas living wage is calculated for each major city in Ontario. And for Ottawa, living wage is $18.60 an hour. So when we were planning our restaurant, we decided to be a living wage employer from get-go. That was extremely important. And as most of you might know, restaurants are infamous for having extremely slim margins. And the decision to be a living wage employer seemed to compromise the financial success of Ayana before even we started. At least that is what the conventional wisdom said. And that is what most of my peers were advising, that this model, the living wage structure, salary structure, might not actually be sustainable in a restaurant industry. However, my son, who's also the executive chef for our restaurant, he and we brainstormed on how we could make this happen. And in order for us to be a living wage employer, it was very clear to us that we had to forego the traditional tipping model, where again, the servers, they get these generous tips and it's up to them. Either they can contribute to the tipping pool, a certain percentage which goes to the back of the house, or it could be an arbitrary distribution, which again, did not sound fair to me for any one of my team members to be at the mercy of generosity of their colleagues. That kind of did not make sense, at least not to an accountant, an outsider to the industry. So we instead decided that we would set our prices that would reflect the full cost of dining experience plus our targeted margin. And that full cost would be based on a salary structure where all employees would be paid living wage or above. And to do this, we had to, first of all, figure out why are we doing it. So there were two major aspects. One is the fairness, which is very much a Canadian value, and it's very important for us. But it also had to make business sense. It was not just enough to do the right thing, to do the socially responsible thing. IANA being a business, we had to make sure that this adopting living wage salary structure would benefit us in one form or the other. And actually, after 2 years of being in operation, we have actually noticed several distinct advantages of being a living wage employer. First of all, I think the biggest advantage that we've experienced is an improvement in our employee retention rate. In my research at planning stage, it was very clear that in restaurant industry, the annual employee turnover approximates around 70%, which is extremely high, but that is the nature of this industry. There's several reasons for that, of course. Inadequate compensation is one, and just in general, the culture where shifts are cut if the guests don't show up, so on and so forth. But that to me, again, it looked like a very, very high rate of turnover. Since we had budgeted a significant amount of resources towards employee training, this employee turnover rate, 70%, was unacceptable. We could never be profitable at that rate of employee turnover. So we were convinced that offering living wage or more was a very effective tool to lower our employee turnover. You might want to know IANA's employee turnover rate, but I think that would drag our dark days of COVID into this conversation, and I'm sure we all have decided to leave it way behind, and we don't want to get there. However, we lost several employees during the series of lockdowns that we experienced here in Canada. Yet, we were able to retain over 60% of our team over the last 1 year, which I think is a big win. And offering a fair and equitable wage is a big part of that success. So, 40% turnover versus 70%, with the extensive the cost of training, I think you can do the math. It was this being a living wage employer has really served us well so far. The other benefit is the effect on employee morale. So our team members take pride in working at IANA because they know that the restaurant values them and strives to pay a fair salary. In fact, they are, anytime the service starts, they're very proud to share that fact with our guests. And as a matter of fact, our guests also appreciate this. So our employees, they are our biggest proponents. And I have received several communications like emails and phone calls from our guests, our patrons, who have called and expressed their appreciation. They are willing to support us. Of course, the dining experience is important, but this is another good reason for them, a very strong reason for them to support us and be our regular patrons. So, without a doubt, I think being a living wage employer has increased our revenue. It has made a definite positive impact. The other factor, of course, is social responsibility. Canada is one of the richest countries on earth. Any Canadian who works for 40 hours a week should be assured of a decent living standard. More people are working for low wages. They are facing impossible choices: buy food or heat the house, feed the children or pay the rent. The result of these minimum wage based jobs, it can result in spiraling debt, constant anxiety, and long-term health problems. In many cases, it means the adults in the family are working long hours, often 2 to 3 jobs, just to pay for their basic necessity. As a matter of fact, while I was interviewing our back of the house staff, I was shocked that most of them were planning to have another job, because that was the experience. So they knew that working 40 hours was not enough. They needed to put another 20 hours in another restaurant just to make their ends meet, which I think is unacceptable, not in this part of the world. So we at IANA, we chose to be living wage employer before the onset of COVID. So we were supposed to open our doors in April of 2020, and then on March 15th, COVID happened. Our timing was impeccable, by the way. We did a great job with timing. But it was very important from the very first stage for us. And being a living wage employer is even more relevant today than 2 years ago. So 2 years ago, when we posted our these jobs, I had to hire 15 servers. I got in excess of 190 resumes. Just last month, I posted another job. I got 2 resumes. That's the reality of current labor market. Mm-hmm. So we are all aware of the difficulties of hiring in the current economy. I believe offering a living wage attracts more applicants to the entry-level positions and helps retain talent. For us, pardon me. Yes.
So Devinder, if I may, I guess one of the questions that sort of came to mind as you were speaking was, I think you've already answered, and that was, was the concept or the foundational concept of offering a living wage a result of a difficult market, or was it something that you just felt was actually a better business model?
For us, there's no doubt about it. It was a better business model, right? Because employee retention is the biggest factor in restaurant industry. And if you can retain your employees, if your servers, your cooks are with you for 4, 5, 7, 10 years, the quality of food and service is significantly elevated, rather than having a revolving door where you have a line cook who's gone in a month or 2 months. So for us, living wage was the way to attract this talent. And mind you, 2 years ago, the living wage, the difference between living wage and minimum wage, which was $12.25 in restaurant industry versus $18.40 at that time of living wage, was almost 54%. But in the meantime, our minimum wage has gone up to $15, and that gap has narrowed down to, I believe, around 24% now. I strongly feel, having a living wage, it really makes business sense in terms of of the, if you measure what does it cost to be a living wage employer versus a minimum wage employer. If you, at the first glance, it looks like, oh my God, I cannot afford to pay 25% increase in my salary expense. Okay. But that is not the whole truth. Here, the accountant in me comes out now. So the fact of the matter is, most of the employers, they're already paying their employees well above, most of their employees well above living wage. Let's say a small business that employs 24 employees or 20 employees. They're the managers, they're supervisors, they're accountants, they're sales staff, and they by no means are making minimum wage. So the minimum wage is being paid only to a very few unskilled employees. And those unskilled employees, unless you're in an industry where a significant portion of your employees are unskilled, which is very rare, at least not in North America, it's the number of, or the percentage of salary that represents minimum wage is very low. I would say less than 5% of the employees are being paid minimum wage. So if you were to take, it's not 100% of your salary expense, which is going to go up by 24%. It is just that maybe the 5% of your salary expense is going up by 24 or 20%. And as a percentage of revenue, we are talking about definitely no more than 0.5% increase in your expenses. And
sorry, and that of course is a key question. And I think you've taken the time in sort of analyzing your business model to take a look at that, and perhaps just encouraging business to actually look at the numbers in the way that you've just kind of laid it out would be really helpful. I have another question with regard to your restaurant operation. I would assume that it's reasonable to assume that the concept of a living wage would change the type of employee. So, full-time family rather than like a transient student. Can you just comment on what kind of impact that has on your business?
So, Ken,
and sorry, Devinder, maybe it's not a fair question because this is your first restaurant experience. So I totally understand if you say, yeah, I really can't answer that.
Well, I mean, I can definitely say that we've been able to retain our employees for sure, and also this being a full-time salaried position, there's a greater sense of belonging. The employees are more committed, and everything matters. And I can tell you, as a matter of fact, at least in a restaurant, if a food that is cooked with love and served with love tastes very different. I don't know what happens, what is the chemistry behind it, but it makes a big difference. And I'm sure in any other service industry or any other business for that matter, when the employees are vested, when they take pride in being part of your team, when they feel valued, that makes a huge difference in the overall operations, in the general atmosphere of the workplace. It's more positive, it's more uplifting, it's more productive. So that 1% increase in expense, and I'm exaggerating that number, most likely if you do the math, it will be less than 0.25%. I'm just saying, okay, I'll exaggerate it 4 times. That 1% increase in expense is far more than offset by the productivity of a happier, financially secure workforce. It makes a big difference.
Yeah. So one last question before we move to Anna's response, and that has to do with sort of the public perception. You mentioned that you had heard expressions of appreciation from your customers. And obviously your customers are, your masters, and in the end decide whether they're prepared to pay a premium, for instance, or anything additional at all for that kind of a model. And I would just wonder if your sense into the 2 years that you've been operating is that that public appreciation and perception has increased at all.
Absolutely, yes. I think in the last 2 years, in general, all our patrons have been very sensitive to the very rough patch that our industry has gone through. But apart from that, it's similar to supporting local. It's close. It means something. You're emotionally invested in that particular business or that project or that product. In our case, as I said, most of our patrons, because anytime they sit down, if they're not if this is their first time, our employees make sure they just tell us no tipping model, we are living wage employed, et cetera, and that really enhances their experience. Now, to begin with, they are reassured in some form or the other, even if their cocktail or their glass of wine shows up, they know they are in a place that is progressive, that is making an effort to do the right thing, to be profitable just by thinking slightly differently, by tweaking the business plan. In our case, it was stepping away from tipping model and going it for whatever prices were. And I'm sure most of the businesses can incorporate this living wage standard rates. It is doable. It's just about putting our heads together, committing to it, and making it happen. And it pays for itself. And in fact, it even results in an increase in revenue and profitability.
Well, thank you for sharing your story. And we will continue this conversation. I'm just going to introduce Dr. Anna Barford. Anna Barford is a Senior Research Associate at Cambridge University's Institute for Sustainability Leadership. Dr. Barford is a social and economic geographer and Prince of Wales Fellow in Pathways to a Circular Economy. She received her PhD in geography from the University of Sheffield and is currently researching how work and livelihoods intersect with environmental problems and solutions. Dr. Barford's primary focus is on informal work in circular systems in low and middle income countries. She also studies how the crises of climate change and COVID-19 intersect with young people's livelihoods in Uganda, Nepal, and Indonesia. And Dr. Barford is co-author of the Business Case for Living Wages report. Thank you for joining us, Anna. So Anna, if you could, please comment on what you heard in Devinder's presentation. What resonated for you?
Sure. Okay. Firstly, thank you very much for inviting me, and it's an absolute pleasure to be here. It was also, Devinder, thank you. I really enjoyed everything you said, and I could listen to you talking about how you developed and fine-tuned your living wage business model for many hours. I think it's a really interesting example, and it also resonates with the research that we've just done. So, just for context, I've just released a new report called A Case for Living Wages, and it's done between my organization, the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership, an organization called Business Fights Poverty, and also with our colleague Jane Nelson, who works at the Harvard Kennedy School. And in this report, we found that really strikingly, a lot of these same benefits, which Devinder has really detailed in the case of his own restaurant. So everything that he's saying about the benefits that living wages can offer, and thankfully not unique to the Iena restaurant, but the benefits that we found from doing a really detailed literature review about what the business benefits could be, which includes studies from the academic literature, but also kind of the grey literature, NGO reports from living wage organizations around the world. We also did 31 expert interviews to back up this report, and a lot of them weren't dissimilar from the sort of information we've just heard from Devinder, actually, about what the motivations were for doing this, how he went about it, and what the outcomes of this have been as well. So we spoke with some business leaders, and we also spoke with other organizations working in this space. For instance, Oxfam or the UN Global Compact, so other organizations who are kind of contributing to this, this discussion in various ways. So I think what Devinder offers is a really fantastic example of how someone who comes from outside a particular sector sees things with fresh eyes and can see some of the issues or the shortcomings which people who are maybe more who've grown up within that industry maybe don't spot because they're used to it and it's normalized. And he really explained so clearly how it was quite a shock to actually see how little people were paid when he entered the restaurant industry. It's also a really nice example of how you can build in living wages right from the very start as like a fundamental aspect of the social and moral responsibility of the business, which is something which many businesses are coming to late in a way, in the sense that they're already, like many big multinational businesses are considering this now, but they're considering it having already developed their business models. So they're kind of, they're incumbent companies who are now thinking, how do we shift what we're doing and shift ourselves towards being living wage employers. So a different starting point, but really nice to think about how, and we were interviewing more large multinationals than kind of single businesses in a single location, and clearly kind of the scale of the company has quite a big and the age of the company affects some of these decisions and how quick or straightforward it is to make those decisions. And by contrast, we also interviewed a veg box company in Cambridge Organic, and for them it was a very different story. They quite similar to you, Devinder. They just decided, that there's no way they couldn't be a living wage company, so they just automatically signed up and then worked out how to make that happen. And I think that that clarity of leadership has been really key, whether it's in smaller companies or multinational companies, having that kind of clear vision and the sense that living wages are really a cornerstone and they're non-negotiable. It's like, we're definitely going to do this. How do we make it happen? Is clearly a really helpful way of thinking about it. So yeah, I think this kind of struggle against conventional wisdom it was interesting for me to hear also that you were coming from an accountancy background, because we've been working with an organization called the Shift Project, who also co-produced this case for living wages with us, and they've spent a lot of time thinking also about how we do our accounting and how we value labor. And one of their interventions in this space has been actually, how about we think about labor costs not as a cost but actually as an investment. And they said, if we look at our budget sheets to try and understand what the impact of living wages are on our budgets, if we're seeing it as an investment in our workforce rather than a net cost, then that helps us to think about living wages and the value that they offer in a very different way. So maybe that's helpful. So like Davinder said, living wages can offer all sorts of benefits: more committed workforce, higher morale, stronger loyalty, lower turnover, and all these things make a huge difference, especially in a restaurant where the care that someone's able to take in preparing food, in cleaning, in serving customers, all these things will definitely translate very, very directly into a sense of it being a nicer place to be and spend time, which is, of course, why people are choosing to go out for dinner in the first place. So just to broaden out a bit from what Devinder was saying, and to kind of share some of our wider findings in our report, I would just want to talk about 3 different spheres in which we're seeing living wages have a benefit. So for businesses. So firstly, I'll talk about core operations, which I think we've heard like really a strong case from Devinder already, but I just want to back that up with our own wider research to show that it's not just a one-off example that we're hearing. Then I'd like to talk about value chains or supply chains, and then also the wider operating environment, because living wages can offer benefits to business which kind of span these 3 different spheres. So firstly, we found in core operation, businesses find much higher levels of employee satisfaction when they're paying living wages. This also comes with improved well-being of employees and is connected to a reduction in absenteeism and illness. As Devinder also mentioned already, worker retention can be much better, partly because people aren't burnt out having to try and find extra work, and partly because of this greater sense of loyalty to the business. So a study of the UK showed in 2017 improved recruitment and retention for employers, which was greater than half of all employers experienced improved recruitment and retention, thanks to paying living wages. There's also an increase in productivity, which has been experienced. So, and this also includes improved quality. So in another study, the vast majority of employers and employees noticed improvements in the quality of the products that we're making. Similarly, 81 suppliers to one global brand, when studied in a kind of one-year trial for living wages, saw a 5% decrease in concerns about productivity over that study period. So again, these how they're being experienced kind of directly in the core operations of the business, and bringing very immediate benefits back to the employer, as well as, of course, to the employee themselves, which is also a really critical point about the living wage movement. Secondly, in value chains or in supply chains, of course, this kind of because, just to be really clear, there's kind of different ways in which you can pay living wages. You can pay living wages in your to your direct employees, or to your direct employees and people you've contracted to provide services for you, or you can make commitments which are much more ambitious and potentially harder to make happen, but also have a greater longer-term impact, which is you can start to pay living wages into your supply chains, and especially for companies which have got kind of strong purchasing power, they can start to make stipulations about requiring the companies supplying them all the way through that supply chain to pay living wages. And increasingly, we're seeing businesses make that first commitment to their direct employees, but also increasingly to supply chains as well, which is, to me, a really exciting progression. And it kind of moves this conversation from addressing, to include addressing poverty in wealthier countries like Canada and the UK, where I live. And it actually gives leverage to the potential of improving wages in a much more widespread way, and potentially tackling world poverty as well as national level poverty, which I see as a really exciting potential for this movement. So in value chains, there's also benefits. So these same benefits that we see for employees can also extend to employees within supplier companies as well. And this can make value chains more stable and more resilient, especially because, like we've seen in an example in the Cambodian clothing sector, people were working excess overtime to the extent that people were fainting at work because they were so exhausted and so tired from the overwork that they were doing. So these benefits can kind of, and then being paid a living wage is a great way to tackle that, because people only do the level of excess overtime that was being done in order to make ends meet. So that was really a good benefit that people were seeing from living wages. It's also good for companies' reputations, and that can make them more of an appealing company to buy from. It can also make them more of an appealing company to invest in as well, which I'll talk about soon. And it can improve the reputation of companies throughout the supply chain, bringing them all benefits in terms of investment and consumers. And then another thing in the value chains is a lot of labour disputes that are experienced are to do with wages. So a lot of companies were finding that actually ensuring that living wages were paid removed that cause of contention and the reason behind some of the labour disputes which were happening, which were taking time and taking money to resolve. And by paying living wages as a minimum standard, as a floor and not a ceiling, that was a very good way to kind of automatically almost remove some of these problems with low pay from the agenda and reduce disputes in the workplace. Lastly, I wanted to talk about the operating environment. So I already talked about the businesses having a stronger reputation with other businesses, but also with their with consumers and citizens. And this can give them a much stronger license to operate, which is becoming increasingly important. Investors are also paying increased attention to living wages to the extent that earlier this year, the organisation Share Action in the UK just made a shareholder resolution to one of our major supermarkets, Sainsbury's, requesting them to become the first living wage supermarket in the UK. So we're kind of starting to see some kind of a bit of activism around that as well in terms of shareholders. And living wages are also seen as a way of managing risk and keeping risk low for investors. And increasingly, there's kind of more regulation around this and more observation to try and understand like who's behaving how and what the implications of that are. So, for example, in the European Union, later this year, it's expected that the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive will actually include a requirement to report on paying living wages or not. So, increasingly, this is becoming kind of part of the conversation. And in fact, last week I was at the World Economic Forum in Davos, and I was lucky enough to hear this work being discussed by some investors, business leaders, and also in major NGOs, and to hear them kind of discussing kind of the benefits that living wages will have. And the conversation went beyond and outside our session at Davos, and I think it came up many times in this wider question of what is the social responsibility of businesses and how can they start to kind of really get a handle on social dimensions of sustainability. And then I think the last thing is, oh, sorry, can I just?
Sorry, Anna. No, yeah, just go ahead and finish.
Sorry. The last thing I was just going to say is that when you pay some of the lowest paid people what they need to live on, that increase in spending often goes very directly to the local economy. So you get a local multiplier effect, whereby a local economic multiplier effect, whereby people are spending more locally, and that can create increased demand for goods and services, and can also lead to job creation locally. And Goldman Sachs did a study, and they actually found that, which won't surprise you, that when lower income people have their incomes raised, that money goes very quickly into the local economy compared to wealthier people having a raise in income, where the money probably just gets put into savings in somewhere. So the kind of the wider economic benefits are much higher as well. So of course, all of this is kind of based on the idea that, like, of course, there's a very, very strong moral case already. But the good news is that it can also work very well for businesses, which Davinder has shown us really clearly. Can I pose a question to Davinder at this point? Because I think I made the case for supply chains quite clearly, but I'm also kind of curious to know from you, Davinder, like, are there any obstacles that that businesses are facing when you're already a living wage business, but you're thinking about how you might kind of scale up that impact? What are the challenges or the difficulties that you might face if you wanted to move living wages beyond your core operations and into your own supply chains?
We would love to be associated with our supply chain partners who are living wage employers. However, matter of the fact is that we have two ends of our supply chain. One are the other local farmers, because we do farm to table, we follow that practice. So those farmers, they're like maybe a couple working together in a farm, literally. So there's no concept of living wage over there. And the other end of the spectrum are these Fortune 500 logistics companies who have a monopoly, and we are not in a position to negotiate anything with them. But it would be nice if more local businesses became living wage employer, and as this concept is widely adopted, I think then there could be some synergies in there, and we could support each other and promote each other's business. So that's one of the reasons why it's really important for more and more businesses to have a good look at being a living wage employer and creating a synergy over there.
So, and I'm going to suggest that what we've heard from the two of you has really encouraged that. Anna, you mentioned, for instance, that accountants, have a particular way of looking at salaries, and perhaps if we can convince them to look at those kinds of things differently, we will see a momentum shift in business, because what you were talking about is essentially social procurement. And that's what got me interested in this whole subject. And I honestly think that social procurement has great benefits potentially for bringing about a change. And I think the business community is a really important contributor to that. So I did have a couple of questions. I was going to sort of hope for 5 or 6 minutes of Q&A. And so I have a couple of questions that have been sent in advance of this event. And I also ask that each one of the participants, if you have questions that have come to mind, please put them in the chat. We'll do our best to try and get to them before we come to a close. It's clear that we're not going to resolve all this in an hour. So, just the more questions that we come away with, the better. So first question, Liliana asks, what advice would you give businesses who have heard of the benefits of paying higher wages to staff, but can't see how their finances allow them to implement this practice? And Devinder, I'll ask you just to go first, and then Anna, if you could follow up with the response as well.
Absolutely. I strongly feel that the sooner this model is adopted in any business, the better it is. The more you wait, the more ingrained your practices become, the more ingrained your thought processes that no, we cannot take in this quarter point increase in our expenses. So if it's part of your business plan from get-go, that's very helpful. But I also understand that living wage is not only for new businesses, it is for every business to adopt. And as entrepreneurs, as business leaders, it is on us and our teams to find those efficiencies and properly analyze the actual cost, the full cost, not just the direct, here's the raise and that's my quarter point increase in expense. We also need to, as Anna also detailed and laid out very, very clearly, we need to figure out what are the offsets. And even if it's if the offsets are just enough to cover your expense and you're not gaining any financial advantage out of it, there are multiple other aspects. There are multiple other advantages that Anna's listed out that make it worthwhile looking into.
Thanks, Devinder. Anna, anything to add?
Yeah, I'd love to add something. But I absolutely support what Devinder's saying. So I think sometimes the customer is willing to take on the extra cost. So I don't know if anyone's heard of the company Fairphone. So they make mobile telephones that are more sustainable, and they looked at paying living wages, and they are paying the equivalent to living wages in one of their factories in China, or one of the factories that supplies them in China. And they worked out that to pay a living wage premium, it added about 0.5% onto the cost of one of their phones. So it was a tiny fraction of the overall cost, which I think sometimes the customer is willing to accept. Another point which I think is really important is just to echo what Davinder said in his talk earlier. Actually, very often the number of people in the company who are earning lower than the minimum wage, lower than the living wage, is actually very low. So it's really important to kind of go away and look very carefully at your pay structure and to really work out how many people this means in practice to raise. And I did this in my own college where I used to work, Girton College in Cambridge, and we looked really carefully and realized there were only, I think, 2 or 3 people in a big college which is home to 600, 700 students. There were only a couple of people who were paid under the living wage. So it was actually quite a small leap. Also in the UK, slightly place specific, but in the UK, our Living Wage Foundation also requires contracts. So for instance, contracts for cleaning staff or catering staff who might be working on site. They require your contracts to be updated to be living wage contracts as well, but they give you 3 years to do that. So I also think like learning what the process is really important, because you might find that actually you can sign up and be a living wage employer right away, and then you've got 3 years in our case to organize your contract. So I think being informed and having some of those conversations to learn a bit more about what's going on. And just a bit of self-promotion. Section 3 of our report actually kind of gives quite a lot of different resources of different organizations who are kind of helping companies map out their route towards living wages and supporting them in terms of thinking about it. So if you are curious about taking the first steps and the subsequent steps towards being a living wage employer, I really think taking a look at Section 3 of our report would be an informative place to at least start. And we actually pose some key questions that businesses can ask themselves to try and help them make sense of where they are now and what the next steps would be. So hopefully that's useful.
With that, I will thank you both. I'm noting the time, it's 12:55, and we want to respect everyone's time. So I guess I'm going to leave the audience with one question, and please post your responses in the chat. What suggestions do you have for us, the New Economy Roundtable, to encourage business to engage in this conversation? What we've heard over the last hour, it has been encouraging to me, encouraging to continue to sort of fight the fight and encourage conversation. And I guess as New Economy Roundtable, how do we get better at bringing business to the table and actually encouraging interest? So thank you very much to both of you as presenters and everyone who attended the webinar today for your thoughtful responses. So I'm going to pass this back to Derek for some closing announcements.
Thanks very much, Ken, Dr. Barford, and Devinder. That was very insightful. I always love to hear new voices and new perspectives on this, and I learn something every time. I hope that everybody has as well. For those of you who are interested in additional information, there are some resources available for you. Of course, the report that Dr. Barford has been talking about, the case for living wages. At the New Economy Roundtable, we've also produced a couple of fact sheets about what businesses can do. They're available on our website, and the website, the link is in the chat, I just see. The Tamarack Institute has also produced some great resources, including something called the 10 Guide, which is a guide for businesses that would like to engage in decent work practices and how that can benefit them. And also a report called Ending Working Poverty in Canada, How to Get It Done. So if anybody is interested in checking that out, we'll send the links around as well. So thanks everyone for joining us today. If this has piqued your interest or you would like to continue sharing ideas about the positive role of business in the new economy, please consider joining the New Economy Roundtable. We are a network of business and non-governmental organizations dedicated to increasing decent work and creating a more inclusive economy. Hosted by the Canadian Poverty Institute at Ambrose University, we meet to share ideas and resources. We organize events like this, and we support and promote supportive public policies. The New Economy Roundtable is a member of Business Fights Poverty, which is a global network of people, companies, and organizations passionate about building an equitable and resilient future. The Roundtable meets every second month over Zoom, and we'd love to have you join us. If you'd like to learn more about the Roundtable, please visit our website, and that link is in the chat, or you can email us at povertyinstitute@ambrose.edu. So in a few days, you'll receive our follow-up email, which will include a link to the recording of today's call. You can also email Alison at tamarackcommunity.ca to provide feedback about today's webinar. We'd love to hear from you to improve your experience. So looking forward to doing this again, and hopefully you can join us once more, thank you once again for joining us, and a huge thank you to all of our panelists for their time today. And I hope that you all have a wonderful rest of your day. Take care.